But the firms later instanced that it was merely a market maker in these transactions, implying that it had a stake in the economic performance of the securities it was selling to clients become less true over time, and even though early deals made a mockery of the notion, the most investors understood what they were buying. For one thing, the synthetic deals were stuffed full of multiplications of risks. Take Abacus 2005 and 3, and not the early tale. The reference obligations that is the securities the CDO's reference consider credits. Those credits included everything from tranches of mortgage banking securities issued by Long Beach Mortgage, Countrywide, Ameriquettes, and New Century to commercial mortgage banked securities to truths banked by selling students' loans to credit card debts issued by MBNA and Chess, who could possibly understand alter risks contained in these securities. Is it any wonder that investors were essentially pulling ratings instead, nor was it possible for investors to know Goldman's own positions. Was Goldman merely standing between two customers, the way a true market maker did, or was Goldman using and designing the CDO in order to hedge an existing position or to express its own view about the reference securities? For instance, Goldman could attempt to profit by having, say, a long position in AAA rated securities, and this used synthetic CDOs to establish a short position in BBB rated securities, or if Goldman was long in New Century mortgage banking securities, the firms could hedge its position by constructing a synthetic CDOs that reference those securities and take the short side of the trade. Buyers had no way of knowing whether Goldman was the deal on the card table. A player or bot, Goldman's supporters would later argue that buyers shouldn't have carried what Goldman's position was. They were responsible for doing their own analysis of the underlying securities. The deal is the deal that sparks the former head of the Goldman's mortgage desk later told the Senate Permanent Subcommittee, but many buyers didn't do not that analysis, and it would later become clear that at least some certainly did care what Goldman himself was doing, just as a cash CDOs was the perfect mechanisms for laundering risk mortgage, so was a synthetic CDO the perfect vehicle for laundering positions a firm wanted to get off its books. For instance, if you owned a bunch of New Century mortgage banked securities, it might be hard to find someone who wanted to own the risk that New Century loans were going to go bad. But if you could establish a short position for yourself by selling your clients the long position in a synthetic CDO therapy, insulating yourself from your unwanted junk by creating new AAA securities. Well, given that Goldman was a big warehouse lender to New Century, and far more likely than its client to have early knowledge that New Century mortgages were dom- domed, the whole edifice begins to take on a very dark hue as Janet Tabacoli, a structured financial expert who became a fierce prescient critic of Sirius, later put it. They had reason to know what they were handing shouldn't have been created in the first place. In addition, Goldman says one person who has looked into these deals had a strongly hold on every aspect of the transactions. The fine print of one Abacus prospectus says that the protection buyer Goldman may have information, including material non-public information, which it did not provide to the buyer's thoughts. If Goldman did have knowledge of New Century Mortgage defaults, it was under no legal obligation to share that knowledge with a client who was about to buy synthetic CDOs that reference New Century securities. In some of the Abacus deals, Goldman called Owen the trade after 3 years if it didn't like how it was going. One blogger later called these hence I win dials you lose. Another perspective notes that Goldman's many roles may be in conflict with the interests of the investors in the transactions. In fairness to Goldman, these pitfalls were identified in writing, but the disclosure didn't make the conflicts go away.